what's up, YouTube and Millennial Reign fans, okay? People thinking we're living in the short season, like myself, okay? Shroud of Turin, look, don't come at me with the whole it's fake, okay? Because I've been researching it for 20 years, and I'm 99.9 on it, okay? It's the most studied artifact by all cross disciplines. In every aspect of it. I'm gonna let this guy, he's a little more eloquent than I am. But what I found really interesting tying into the Millennial Reign kingdom here is that he mentions the coins back then, and he mentions there were coins in the first few centuries AD, right? This is Byzantine, this is Constantinople, this is the center of Christian, right? This is the Millennial Kingdom, okay? And on the coins, on the face of the coin, is the same face that's on the shroud, which I believe is the face of Jesus Christ, okay? And then the other tie-in, you know, why I'm dropping this here, is that the shroud was, it's not a Catholic relic, okay? That's a huge turnoff, right? Like, that, it actually was in the hands of private families all the way up until 1988, when that monstrosity, the Vatican, took it over and put it in Turin, okay? So it's not like this Catholic relic, okay? So get over that and do some research into it. The physics of it, the, you know, what it would take to reproduce it. This guy's just he's just gonna have like 1,000-foot, 30,000-foot overview of it, but he mentions these things, okay? But while it was in, he says, yeah, it was like traveling through, you know, traveling around in the possession of these private families. But he said that it was in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire there, for 1,000 years. So if I was Jesus and I was ruling the earth, right, I'd have my shroud. I'd have the shroud being like hanging out there, and I'd probably have my mug on the coins too, right?
Evidence of it going to Constantinople, which would have made sense because that was the capital of Christendom for 1,000 years. We have similar coins that look just like the image in the shroud. So we look into what's called numismatics, the history of coinage. Again, they didn't have social media in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, so you had to look on coins to see who was in power, who the local deity was. Well, we see images that match the man of the shroud in these coins. The second breaking news item from just a month ago is a different study on the blood.
Yeah, okay. That was my next question. So, okay.
Yeah. And this shows, again, of course, they actually they did additional blood sample work on the blood. There's blood all over the shroud. Yeah. And what's fascinating about it is the blood seeps all the way through the shroud fibers. But when you put it under the microscope, the image of the shroud, which comes after the blood, is superficial and only goes in about a thread or two deep. Again, you could never redo this if you were trying to create a hoax. Like, it would be impossible. So the blood, which is before the resurrection, that Jesus' body is wrapped in, seeps all the way through the fibers of the herringbone linen cloth. But the sepia image of the shroud of Jesus, this electromagnetic radiation light burst, electrical burst, it leaves a superficial image that's only a couple fibers deep of each thread in the linen shroud. Again, how would you reproduce? How would anyone know to do that? How could you do that? Science can't tell us how. And again, it's not pigment, it's not dye, it's not paint. There's no man-made substance on it. And so that's the second. So it studies the blood, and it showed that this crucified victim was dying of organ failure. It shows that the crucifixions, they can tell from these blood samples his circulation was slowing because he was under such trauma. There's a high level of creatinine, not to be confused with creatine, creatinine, which is excreted when you're under trauma. Huge levels of ferritin in the blood. Unfortunately, I know what this means because my dad had organ failure and he had huge, very high ferritin levels. His body was shutting down. Same with the crucified man. And then also the blood is red, Melissa, And again, for any hematologist who's looked at human dead blood, it kind of turns almost a blackish brown. Well, not if it has bilirubin. The crucified man was under such trauma that the liver begins to secrete bilirubin, which keeps the blood this very, very resonant red color. And in early YouTube videos of me doing the press for my book series, I completely discount the shroud. I just said, I follow the evidence. I work with evidence. I don't privilege things that are mystical, and I really
you didn't
blow
go in
it
with
off.
A bias. That's important.
I had a bias that the shroud was a Catholic relic, that there was nothing evidential about it related to the resurrection, and therefore I didn't believe in it until, as I said in your first question, I actually started reading the reports for myself. And a couple of Bible scholars who I very highly regard challenged me. They said, Jeremiah, you're becoming known as kind of the resurrection guy. You need to look a little bit deeper into the shroud. And I'm like, okay, I'll do that. And so I started reading it. And so the Shroud of Turin currently we're talking about a 14-foot wide linen burial sheet, essentially. Okay, think like a bed sheet. Okay, that's what a shroud is. It's essentially, and we have hundreds of these from antiquity, especially from the land of Jesus in Judaica, Jerusalem, what is the land of Israel today. We have hundreds of burial shrouds, and in Jewish burial traditions, on the day of your death, you would be wrapped in a burial shroud, and you would be placed in a family burial tomb. These, if you're following at home or wherever you're watching this, I actually have my Bible with me. We see that the shroud is mentioned in Matthew 27, 57 to 61. The shroud is mentioned in Mark 15, 42 to 47. It's mentioned again in Luke 23, 50 to 56. John chapter 20, it is mentioned again, verses 1 through 18. And so we are told that two members of the Sanhedrin ask Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, this is right in alignment, Melissa, with Jewish burial traditions, because according to the Mishnah, which is another early Jewish writing, if the Sanhedrin condemned a criminal to death by Roman capital punishment, it was the Sanhedrin's responsibility to bury the crucified criminal. What do we see happening in the juridical procedure in the Gospels? Two members of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea, and we see Nicodemus request the body from Pilate. Remember, Pilate, and we'll get into this in a little bit, Pilate is shocked that Jesus died so soon. Jesus dies in less than 6 hours on the cross. Passover is that evening. And Jewish burial traditions, you had to bury before nightfall. There was a lot of superstition in Jewish burial traditions. They're moving fast, they get the body, and then they lay the body. And just for benefit of the audience, those of you that are watching this, maybe if you're listening later, you can watch it. This is the easiest way I can express it. I'm holding in my hand a piece of paper that's representative of the shroud, and the body is my phone. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in a shroud that covers the body like a pita, almost like a taco shell. The face would be here, obviously the head back here, and then the whole body is wrapped. That's why it's 14 feet long. The person who is crucified, the man in the shroud who is crucified, is around 170 pounds of weight, almost 6 feet tall, which is fascinating. We'll come back to why that matters in a little bit. And then other linen strips are placed around the burial shroud. So you don't have just this shroud, okay? You have other strips as well that would have essentially wrapped horizontally around the elongated strips. What's fascinating about the shroud of Jesus is, unlike the hundreds of burial garments that we have from antiquity and late antiquity, Melissa, this shroud has a full image in it of a crucified criminal. And the crucifixion marks on this crucified criminal link up and match. They correspond with the descriptions of Jesus' crucifixion that were given in all 4 of the canonical Gospels. That's what's mind-blowing about it. And this is an area that I actually have a lot of expertise in. This whole notion of Roman crucifixion, and the sources that we have for Roman crucifixion are fantastic. What's amazing about Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus was crucified in a particularly demonic, heinous way. Roman criminals were not always, in fact, ever. We only know of one Roman criminal who was given a cap of thorns to wear on his head from antiquity, and that's, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. We know of only one Roman criminal who was ever stabbed in the heart through his side by a lance wound in his side, going up his torso into his heart. We have evidence of only one, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. When you look at the way that he's crucified with the nails that go through his wrists, and by the way, you Greek scholars at home, the same Greek word for hands and wrists is in the New Testament, so there's no contradiction there. What do we have in the image of the shroud? He's not nailed through his hands. That wouldn't work. He's nailed through his wrists and through his feet. Not everybody was nailed to the cross. Again, Jesus is crucified in a particularly painful way. None of the bones are broken on the crucified man in the Shroud of Turin, so there's no broken legs. What do we see, again, playing out in the execution procedure of Jesus? They go to break Jesus' legs, they see he's already dead. He'd experienced such trauma, he dies before the customary breaking of the legs to hasten death. Jesus was already dead. When you look at the flagellation, that the crucified, that's a Latin term meaning being whipped, essentially, by the Roman flagrum. The flagrum was sometimes it was called a cat of nine tails. The term is flagrum, and it was a whip that had 3 cords. On the end of each cord are lead barbell kind of teeth at the end of that, and that's what would have struck the crucifixion victim. And I've actually just updated my research, and I'm happy to share this in our interview because it's likely that Jesus suffered over 700 wounds. That's what we see evidenced in the man of the shroud. The crucified victim of the shroud was lashed 120 times by that Roman flagrum. Just think about that. Let that sink in. There are wounds all over his body. We also see in the crucified man, see if this is memorable, there's additional abrasions on the shoulders. Why would that be? Jesus is asked to carry the patibulum. That's the crossbeam of the cross as he makes his way to Calvary. He can't carry it. It's too heavy. It's around 70 pounds. I couldn't carry something that was 70 pounds if I had been whipped 120 times either. Jesus barely makes it to the cross. And so these are all features on the Shroud of Turin. In the punctures in his head, I just want to say this, for me, virtually guarantee for me it's Jesus. The wound on the side, the lance wound, in my opinion, removes all doubts because no one else was crucified that way in the time of Jesus. For there's a correspondence between the evidence of the crucified man in the shroud and the way that we know Jesus was crucified, which was utterly unique in the Roman world for its time. Again, you didn't always fashion a crown of thorns and stick it on. Again, they knew he called himself the King of the Jews. They were mocking him. Normally, there would be broken bones. Sometimes, if I'm being interviewed on a really fast show, I might say he had a broken nose. And what I mean by that, I don't mean the bone of his nose was broken, but I do mean that the ligaments were broken. The man in the shroud, his nose is actually pushed over to the side.
I've noticed that. Okay. I've seen photos,
beaten.
and I'm like, that nose looks okay.
The right side of his face is like he's been in a heavyweight bout. So there are things that, again, correspond to the way in which that Jesus was crucified. And again, the most detailed account that we have of Roman crucifixion antiquity come from 4 books that you may have heard of: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then the book of Josephus. So those are some of our best sources, according to Bible scholars, related to the crucifixion. And so the gospel writers really help us out. And so what I began to see was a correspondence between the way in which, so then you have to ask yourself, if this is a forgery, if this is a hoax, how do you know these certainties about Jesus of Nazareth, the way in which he was crucified? And that's where it set me down a path of really checking out this deeper, to where it's like, hey, if I'm going to stake my academic reputation on this, I need to learn more about it. So I'm not quoting Bible scholars here. There are over 50 cross-disciplinary scientists who have spent time with the shroud. Most of them going into it thought the shroud was a hoax, and almost all of them now believe the shroud is authentically the burial cloth of Jesus. And why? When they study all the correspondence, it's type AB blood. The blood in the Shroud is human blood. It's not animal blood. It's not paint. It's not dye. When you look at the STIRP project, that would be the Shroud of Turin research team, known as by the acronym of STIRP. These 50 scientists who are, when they began to study the Shroud using all of the disciplines available to them and all of the scientific tests available to them, what caused me to start really believing in the authenticity of the Shroud is the best science of today, and I mean right now, cannot prove or explain or duplicate how there is an image that has a molecular quality, it has a chemistry to it, there's a physics to it. They cannot reproduce this. So science, if it is a hoax, modern scientists have no idea how to explain how it occurred.